I still want to have a little producer with a little clipboard and pointing at me and all of that.
That'd be great.
Yeah, our production values aren't up there quite yet. Sorry, it's yeah, we're not quite there. All right, so it is time to read a new book. It's still part of the Chumash. It's still part of the Torah, of course. And I know that joke is old, but I like to remind people that Vayikra is a new book. Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, is a new book. Unfortunately, for many people, the book of Leviticus is not their favorite book. For many of us, we may have been enjoying that little burst that we talked about in last week's class, how that slice of God's presence coming and filling the Mishkan, the tabernacle. That may have, yes, we got the narrative going again. No more of these nitpicky details. Well, we're going to get into a different kind of details. I'm not going to call them nitpicky because as detailed-oriented as all the sockets were, these are details which, when studied carefully, reveal a great deal. These are the details of the sacrifices, the details of the sacrificial service that was conducted in the Mishkan. We didn't just build the tabernacle to look pretty. We built it in order that we could do things there. And the things that we're going to do there are talked about in this book of Leviticus. Make sense? Okay. Oi. Oh, you don't say oi. It's good stuff. It's good stuff. And we're going to go ahead and start off with just a taste of Leviticus, but then I'm going to bring you a selection that's brought from Abarbanel's Introduction to Leviticus. Again, as I mentioned last week, you are in good company if you think that not all of the information contained in these sections of the Torah seems immediately relevant or spiritually uplifting. That has been something that our ancestors also noticed from time to time, that first read wasn't always inspiring. And so they, of course, read it a second time and a third time and cross-referenced and looked for patterns and looked for details. And, well, we're going to explore some of those. But we can't explore them until we've seen the surface. So let's get to work. We're going to start right up at the beginning, page 585, first line of Vayikra. Remember, again, in the Torah, this is only a matter of a few line spaces, and then we pick up right where we left off with last week's reading, with our classes reading, I mean, where we finished the tent of meeting had been filled by this presence of God, and boom, now comes the next verb.
The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him.
Pause there, right? The Lord called, Vayikra. Yeah, that's how it actually begins, right? And called. It's meant to be the next step from the tent being set up and the cloud filling it and God's presence being there. No lag time. The tent is done. Boom, we are now receiving on all wavelengths, and God calls out from this tent, not from the mountain anymore, right? Not from Mount Sinai, where we're at the foot of Mount Sinai, but the cloud is no longer on Mount Sinai, it's on the tent. The voice is no longer coming from Mount Sinai, it's coming from the tent. So this is meant to be a very smooth and very powerful transition and very symbolic transition. All right, so this voice of God is calling out from the tent, and it is saying,
"Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any of you presents an offering of cattle to the Lord, he shall choose his offering from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall make his offering a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting for acceptance in his behalf before the Lord. He shall lay his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, that it may be acceptable in his behalf, in expiation for him. The bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer the blood, dashing the blood against all sides of the altar, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The burnt offering shall be flayed and cut up into sections. The sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire on the altar and lay out wood upon the fire, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall lay out the sections with the head and the suet on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. Its entrails and legs shall be washed with water, and the priest shall turn the whole into smoke on the altar as a burnt offering, a gift of pleasing odor to the Lord."
okay. Sound good?
No.
No. Wait.
Sounds like a slaughterhouse.
Sounds like a slaughterhouse. All right, so that's my first point, which is,
Yes.
why does this sound less good than dinner last night?
Yes, much less.
Well, but dinner last night, if you had meat, was prepared in much the same way. You had an animal, the animal was slaughtered, parts were removed. In Judaism, the blood is also removed, and then you eat it. Why is the idea that the animal would be slaughtered and placed upon the altar somehow more distasteful than the fact that you like hamburgers?
The very idea of splashing the blood on the altar and the fact that, the entrails and the head, all of these things.
But they have those parts. I mean, they don't come in cellophane wrap off a tree.
Well, we know that. And the little sticker that says, that used by Thursday.
Exactly.
And the other part that's jarring is that all of this the odor will be pleasing to God. What?
Okay. So the olfactory sentence, right? The idea that this will create an odor that is pleasing to the God, this reach nichoach, is also seems a bit unsettling, because does God really smell? And that's another very good point. So,
and the odor isn't totally pleasing if you burn.
No,
if you burn your meat on the grill, which I've done on occasion. It gets to a point where it's no longer pleasing.
Yeah, there's the law of diminishing returns. You overcook meat, you turn it into complete smoke, and it's not exactly the most fragrant thing in the world.
And I also think if I had to watch this, I would become vegetarian.
Yeah.
Well, there is a definite squeamishness in the modern world, because we have distanced ourselves from most food manufacturing, that we're not used to the idea that hamburger only became a hamburger because somebody killed a cow. But when you are a farmer, or even just part of a pre-industrial world where you see the food in your community, you can see the meat hanging in the butcher shop and it still looks like a cow, just without skin on. You're more used to the notion that eating requires some level of transferring what is alive into a not alive state so that I can stay alive. And whether it has a pulse or whether it has sap, it was alive before it went into me at some stage in its existence. And that's just how we continue to live. We don't have photosynthesis. We can't just lay out in the sun, even if you're from California, and absorb the sun's radiation and live off of that. We are going to have to take something that was alive, render it unalive, in order that we can stay alive. It works. Why do we not feel that when it comes to the sacrifices, when it comes to dedicating this process to God, shouldn't that make this process even better, even more glorious, even more wonderful, that we're taking something that we normally use just to feed our stomachs and we are rendering it into something that is sacred rather than merely gastronomic?
Well, I think in modern terms, anyhow, we look at this as sort of pagan.
All right. So pagan and primitive, if I can add on that. There's a definite feel in the modern world that if you need to kill something to worship your God, that just seems wrong. That what kind of God would want us to slaughter an animal? What kind of God would want us to butcher it and throw it on the fire and all of that? Now, we have talked about this in previous classes and talked about the balance between this being a concession by God towards us, our own instinct and our own training up to this point of needing sacrifices as a spontaneous form of worship, and that this was meant to rein it in, to control it in a certain way. The emphasis on the odor was to emphasize the purely intangible as being the true essence of what is occurring here, rather than the tangible, meaning the meat. But there is definitely something to be said for a physical act feeling more powerful than a mere emotion that's contained within us. And that's not especially pagan or primitive. And that's something that still permeates Judaism. Not so much with the actual slaughtering an altar, obviously, but so much of Jewish ritual and Jewish life and Jewish spirituality is embedded in the physical. It's embedded in the concrete. We could celebrate Shabbat without lifting a Kiddush cup, without having challah, and without having the candles in a technical, philosophical sense, and simply sit and contemplate creation and contemplate God and contemplate the peace of this moment. But I think most of us have found that when we do stuff, it makes us feel stuff better, and it makes us understand stuff better. And so when we look at the details of the stuff they did and the slaughters that they did, we might be able to find some meaning to this, that would elude us if we were just to let ourselves be recoiled by the blood and guts of what's happening. Does that sound like at least a possible plan? That maybe if we can hold our nose and put on some rubber gloves, we can dig through this and find something?
Well, perhaps by doing it at an altar in this manner, we're also elevating the ordinary and making it holy. The way we elevate Shabbat to make it a different day by focusing on, by doing things.
By doing things, exactly.
Doing things that make it elevated.
And the specifics of what we do seem to matter in Judaism, right? It's not that you can celebrate Shabbat. Well, if you don't want to light candles, why don't you just light some fireworks, or why don't you just drive around the block 3 times and turn backwards and swing a dead cat over your head. It's not just random statements of action that we can then imbue with symbolism. There seem to be specifics into the symbolism, and the sacrifices, as we're going to see throughout the book of Vayikra, have a lot of specifics. So let's go ahead and hit Abarbanel's introduction and see what he can pull out of all of this with our rubber gloves and tweezers and a clothespin on the nose.
Yeah, right, really.
To see that maybe there is something. It's our printer's on the blink. That's why it's not. That's why it's not the normal front and back.
Oh, I see. Not double-sided.
Yeah, it's not really that we're going through 4 pages. Don't worry. It's just not double-sided because our printer's on the blink, and it's not doing that right now.
Well, at least it did this much.
Compared to the old days when you just had to sit there and listen because the rabbi would be the only one with the book. Yeah, this is a big step up. Oh, the mimeograph. But see, then you got that wonderful smell. Yeah, I used to help my mother with the little room off the office where they had the mimeograph machine.
Yeah.
And I don't know who thought it was a good idea to put that in a small, unventilated room. But after 10 minutes of doing copies, it was just, what number am I on again? All right, so Abarbanel, one of the great medieval commentators, he wrote a much lengthier introduction to the book of Leviticus. I have taken excerpts from it in order that we can compress it within our own time. But highly recommend any of his works that you can get your hands on. Hopefully you'll be impressed by what he does, just as I was. All right, Harry, are you still up for reading?
Sure.
Sure.
Sure. The knowledge of the sacrifices, despite it being explained in the verses of the Torah, are hidden from us today, since it is not practiced and the service has been lost with the destruction of our temple and our glory.
Okay, so his opening salvo is fairly revealing and fairly honest, which is to say, we don't and can't really understand easily the glory and the secrets of the sacrifices. Yeah, we've got the text of the Torah. We can say this many cows on this day and that many sheep on this day, and we can say this part gets burnt and this part gets eaten because we can read it. But why and what it meant and the secrets of all of this, well, that's hidden. And he's going to try to transmit some of what was hidden and what was passed on to him. But he's alerting us that you have to look beyond the surface level. If you just read the first lines or just read the surface of all the lines of the Torah, you're missing a lot of what's meant to be learned from all of these sacrifices, and meant to be learned by the rest of us, even those who don't stand in the days of the temple and can't offer these sacrifices at the altar. This is not just a sacrificial instruction manual. This is a book of meaning. So let's see if we can dig a little.
The word zebach and the word korban are not synonyms referring always to the same thing.
All right, so I deliberately left them in transliteration because his whole point in this opening section is to clarify the terminology. Korban, as we'll see, is usually the word that's translated as sacrifice, and a zevach often gets translated as an offering. And of course, that's really, really confusing in English. But in Hebrew, as he's going to point out, they are 2 very distinct things, and one is a subset of the other.
While every zevach is a korban, the reverse is not the case, that every korban is not a zevach.
Right? So it's, if you want to think of it as like, those good old Venn diagrams, if you remember from your days of math or logic, right? You've got a korban, you've got sacrifices, korbanot. And within them, you have a very large subcategory called zvachim. Right? This is a zevach. And that's a type of korban. So every zevach is also a korban, but there are also lots of things that are a korban that are not a zebach. Make sense? Okay, so let's see what the difference is.
For the zevach refers to a living creature which is slaughtered and offered upon the altar. For this is the name for slaughter, as it said in Deuteronomy, and you shall slaughter
V'zevachta.
of your cattle and sheep as I have commanded you.
All right, so he's saying the word zevach, which, like I said, usually gets translated as being a type of offering, comes from the same root, meaning to actually slaughter. Therefore, if it's a zevach, right, it's got a pulse.
Oh.
Right? If I can't say alive because the other things are also alive, but a zevach has a pulse and it needs to be slaughtered. And I'm putting that in quotes because, as you're going to see, that's a technical term for slaughter here. Okay? Okay.
Therefore, every zevach is a korban which is offered upon the altar. But there is a korban which is not a zevach, which is the korban of birds, for there is no slaughter in it.
All right. So over here, we've also got this other thing that is an offering, a korban of birds. And birds do not technically, for the altar, have shechita, have slaughter. Right? They are killed, but the way that they are killed is not the formal form of slaughter when they are being used on the altar. So he's saying, therefore, they fall into a different category. They're still a korban, but they're not a zevach, even though they have a pulse, because they weren't slaughtered in the technical way that the animals are slaughtered. All right, good. Let's keep going with some
And
text.
the mincha as well, which is called a korban and is not a living creature, for the name zevach it's not a living creature for the name zevach to apply to it. If so, the korban is a more inclusive term than the zevach, for the korban refers to anything which is slaughtered and which is offered or brought near upon the altar.
Okay, so korban it's brought near to the temple because it comes from the word she'it karev, to draw near, right? So the word for sacrifice, or the word that in English is normally translated as sacrifice, shares the same root in Hebrew with bringing something closer, of drawing close to something. So when we say sacrifice and bring close, they sound totally different in English. But when we say korban and she'it karev, I don't know if you can hear, but the root words are identical, right? So this is my closer bringer that I am bringing close, would be an English rendering that tried to preserve the similarities. And so all of these things are designed to bring us close, as we're going to see. But the mincha, this is neither something with a pulse nor something that is slaughtered. It is plant type, and we're going to see a few other categories of offerings or substances as well. We'll get into that in more detail. All of these korbanot, zevach, bird sacrifices, mincha sacrifice. How are we doing? Too technical? Don't worry, it means something. It means something.
They are named korban for two reasons.
All right, remember, the whole circle is called korban, the sacrifice.
It is offered upon the altar. It creates great, that's number one.
Right.
Number two, it creates great closeness between the one bringing it and God. And this is, as stated in Deuteronomy, and who is likewise a great nation has God so close to them. And who is likewise a great nation has God so close to them.
Right.
And that word for close must be the same as the word for offered.
Kruvim, exactly. Right, it comes from the same root word. So one reason why we call these things korban is because we offer them and we sacrifice them. I mean, he's basically saying, yeah, that's what you call the things that you actually do the word sacrifice with. Just like in English, I sacrifice the sacrifice, right? So I offer the offering, same in with the word korban. When it comes to why that word in general, because that word comes from the same root as we just mentioned, to mean to be close to something. The sacrifices were designed to bring us close to God. They were designed as a pathway for closeness, of spiritual closeness between us and God. Now, that may sound a bit strange. Most of us may find the idea of sacrificing an animal as, how does that bring me closer to God? And yet, there are numerous things that we do that we might more readily think bring us closer to God. When we perform the commandments, when we join in prayer, when we work with a community, when we are studying text, we might think these also bring us close to God. Why would those acts bring us close to God, but a sacrifice not? Just because we're used to them, right? And because we live at a time when there is no temple and there are no sacrifices, we've naturally come to distance ourselves, pun intended, from their bringing closeness ability. All right, let's see if we can try
If you have to bring it to the altar first, I mean, otherwise you just kill an animal in the field, eat it, you never think twice about where it came from or who created it. But if you have to stop and say, wait a minute, before I can do this, at least once a week or however often, I have to bring this to the temple, let the priests take care of it, put the blood on the altar, and God will smell it. That's who brought it to me, and now I can eat.
There's a much higher level of mindfulness in this whole process. Absolutely. Right. And for many people, the only meat they would be eating would be meat that had been at some point brought to the altar. Most people could not afford to simply have a hamburger every night. Not just because their doctor said it wasn't good for them. They just simply couldn't afford that amount of meat. Yeah, we say, uh-oh. Does that mean it's not working? No, something else. Okay, good. You know, someday I'm going to learn to trust the technology and not have to worry about distractions. Okay, let's go ahead and see where Abarbanel goes with this map.
The Torah mentioned that the korban, in general, from the domesticated animals, and these are the three species of behema, which is the cows, sheep, and goats.
All right, sorry for my grammatical incorrectness in writing that sentence, but hopefully you were able to get through it better than if I'd left it in the Hebrew, which is the Torah talks about korban in general, and it usually does that by referring to domesticated animals, cows, sheep, and goats. Those seem to be occupying a place of privilege in the hierarchy of sacrifices. Cows, sheep, and goats. Now that I know this is not anything about that, please give me a moment while I turn down the volume. Okay, just in case I get further notice.
And some of korbanot are flying species, the turtle doves and young pigeons. And some are from the plants, namely the mincha, which is of three types, bread, oil, and wine. Added to them is frankincense.
All right, so we've got, a second, let's mix up the pen colors, because why not? Yeah. We've got cows, sheep, and goats are in the main category of our zevach, right, which is one type of korban. And then we have two pigeons and turtle doves over here. And then for mincha, we've got flour, meaning the grain type of flour, not the smell of flour, oil, and wine, plus a little frank. I'm not going to attempt to spell frankincense. Can't spell Frankenstein. I'm not going to spell frankincense. All right. So these are the actual ingredients that go into each of the different types of korbanot, of different types of sacrifices. And now he's going to tell us why. Because maybe you've always wondered, why a cow? Why a sheep? Why goats? Why turtle doves? Why pigeon? Why these things for sacrifices? Is it just because God's picking on cows? Or is there some specific reason?
There is no doubt that the choicest and better korbanot before God are the three species, namely the cows, sheep, and goats.
All right. Woohoo!
That's the best.
Cows, sheep, and goats, they apparently are number one. What? How did he derive that? Keep going.
Thus, there are no turtle doves or young pigeons in the communal offerings, nor is there a mincha in a voluntary offering. Rather, all the zevachim of the community are only from these three animal species. All
right, so remember how I said that God is in the details? You keep reading through Vayikra and you read the details of all the sacrifices and you compare what can individuals offer and what does the community have to offer. When it comes to the community, boom, cows, sheep, and goats only. No pigeons and turtle doves are being offered as a community sacrifice. It is a cow, a sheep, or a goat, and done. Now, there are mincha offerings that are offered on behalf of the community. So he has to explain that as not being one of the top. And he says, yes, but look, when a individual wants to bring a voluntary offering, not one that they are required to by the book, but one that they personally just, I want to bring one, right? I want to bring a voluntary offering because it's just, I'm feeling it today and let's go. You don't get to bring a mincha offering. You can't say, here's my voluntary offering and put a sack of grain in front of the priest. If you're bringing a voluntary one, it's going to be one of the big three. It's going to be a cow, a sheep, or a goat. Why? Because it's voluntary. And so when it's voluntary, God can set the bar where he wants. Right? Think about that for a second, right? When we ask, when someone says, you know, I like to volunteer and I'm not demanding them to do anything, then I can, if they want to voluntarily step forward, I can set the bar wherever I like because I'm not demanding it of them. Does that not make sense?
No, because if you demand it of them, you can also set the bar wherever you want. If it's not volunteer.
Yes.
You can also.
Except what happens when you demand of somebody and you set the bar high?
You don't get anything.
Exactly. Right? You set people up for failure. Right? If you demand it and you make it hard to fulfill, it's going to be a failure. On the other hand, if you don't demand it, if someone wants to, then you know what? I can be specific. Right? Think for a second about if somebody says, you know what, I'd love to give you a sofa for your new house. That's very nice of them to volunteer a sofa for the new house. Are you allowed to tell them what color? Are you allowed to tell them what size?
Sofa.
Really? If I show up tomorrow with an old sofa that I found on the side of the road and said, Marion, look, I found a sofa and I thought of you. Here, have it. You would say,
Take it to Goodwill.
take it to Goodwill, right? Because ironically, not beggars can be choosy, right? When you're not demanding it, you can actually say, well, actually, that's lovely, but we already have a sofa, or I'm afraid that's too big for our living room, or it doesn't really match the colors of the living room, and no, you can set some limits when you're not demanding it of others.
Like a bridal registry.
Like a bridal registry, exactly. Although people are welcome in that.
Some people want to give you something, so you put out a whole list of things you can use.
Yeah.
Exactly, of things
So
that you would like.
Everybody gains from that gift rather than nothing.
What about the poor person who doesn't have a cow or sheep or a goat?
Were you reading ahead?
Oh.
No,
Were you reading ahead?
no.
Okay.
Or we
So-
have to that.
So yes, what happens for the poor person for a voluntary sacrifice, right? Voluntary, capital V, important word here, is a voluntary sacrifice can only be made from one of these three. If you can't afford one of these three, you cannot make a voluntary sacrifice, right? But remember, voluntary means going above and beyond what was required. When it's a required sacrifice, Harriet, keep reading.
Others have said that the three species, cows, sheep, and goats, are singled out as zebachim and to be offered on the altar for two reasons. One, because these three species, in their temperament, character, and nature of feeding, are choicer and better than all living creatures, save those that speak.
Meaning humans,
Yes.
right? So if you look at the whole animal kingdom, say this is from Rambam and Ralbag and others that Barbanel is quoting here, he says, you look at all the other animals out there, look at the way a pig eats. Have you ever seen the way dogs, the way they can behave sometimes? I'm not sure that they're exactly the most estimable animals. And, monkeys and squirrels and rats and snakes. Really, can you find three better animals in all of their character and demeanor than the cow, the sheep, and the goat? And by the way, do not judge cows, sheep, and goats by their modern equivalents. You have to look at the natural and wild versions in the modern world, or the semi-domesticated ones in the modern world, because we have bred the stupid into all these animals, and we have bred them to be perfectly fine, to be fat, lazy, and stuck in pens for their whole life, because that's more economical. But in their more natural state, and in the way they would have lived in the ancient world, a cow and a sheep and a goat really were quite exemplary animals as far as having a calm demeanor, as being pleasant, as well as being tough and being resourceful and being cooperative and being very beneficial to humanity. These really were three very special animals for the ancient world. Indeed, between these three, really civilization was born. Without the domestication of animals, we would not have gotten out of the hunter-gatherer stage, as you can see by other parts of the world, where animals were not easily domesticated or didn't have the same benefits that these three brought with them.
So is there anything to the fact that they all are in groups?
The fact that they are herdable social groups is one of the reasons why they can be domesticated. To the best of my knowledge, and I'm no zoologist, to the best of my knowledge, it is exceedingly hard to domesticate a non-herd or pack or social animal. You can train them, but domestication, that is the point where you actually breed them to become tractable and used to human interaction, I think only works with social animals. It's what I remember reading somewhere, but it's been a while since I was in biology class, so I can't swear to that. All right, and there's a second reason.
And two, they are more readily available.
Yay for Jewish practicality.
Yes.
Right? And these three animals, in addition to being really good as far as animals go, they're available, right? Because otherwise...
Therefore, there is no korban from the wild animal species, for God did not wish to burden us to bring a korban from that which is difficult to find.
So imagine if God had said, if you want to bring a sacrifice, you need to bring a giraffe.
Yeah.
Oh. I mean, which is a kosher species, right? But imagine if every time you wanted it, you had to go and chase down a giraffe in order to bring it. And you can't kill it, right? Because it has to be alive when it's brought to the altar. So you've got to find a way to track and capture a giraffe alive 3,000 years ago. Would not exactly be a reasonable request for God to make of us. And God is reasonable, is the underlying assumption here. And this is
also why he commanded that the korban of fowl be only from the turtle doves and young pigeons for these same reasons.
All right. So because the turtle doves and young pigeons also have these same attributes. And we're going to get to the issue of poverty in just a little bit. Okay, but we've already got the basic idea here that these three already make it more accessible to a greater section of the population, and that they have intrinsic qualities, their availability as well as their character, that make them ideal candidates for this. But Abarbanel, he doesn't just sit by what the other people have said, he also adds his own interpretation of why these animals in particular.
And their words are correct. However, there are an additional two reasons. One of them is that these three species hint to our holy ancestors, for behold, the cow alludes to Avraham Avinu.
All right. Did you ever think that somebody would say, when you look at a cow, think of Abraham? Right? But that's exactly what he's saying. And this may be, again, part of what can help us uncover the secrets of the korbanot and what they meant for our ancestors that we have lost. Because most of us, when we think of the word cow, we think of fat or stupid or just, crammed into a feedlot. We don't think of the cow as being a noble animal. And yet here he is comparing the cow to Abraham, which tells you that cows were not considered to be a dumb beast of worthless animal in the eyes of the ancient people, or even in the Middle Ages when Abarbanel lived. So how does he make the connection?
For just as the cow is the largest of the species of domesticated animals, so was Abraham the greatest of the Avot.
The greatest of our ancestors, right? So Abraham was the biggest, cow is the biggest. Abraham and cow, they go together. That's not his only reason.
Also because it is stated about him, and Abraham ran to the cattle, and he took a calf, soft and good.
You may remember from the story when the angels appear to Abraham at Mamre, and he is rushing to prepare a meal for them. He rushes to the cattle. He rushes to the cows. So when we think of the cow, we can think of Mr. A, Abraham. Okay?
And the sheep allude to Yitzchak, for the sheep is the next level after the cow.
Right? Isaac is next in line of the patriarchs, and the sheep is next in line of the sacrifices. So therefore, Isaac and sheep go together. And what beautiful connection do we have?
Also because of the ram,
which is a male sheep.
The male sheep, which his father offered as a burnt offering in his place at the time of the Akedah, as it states, and he took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son.
Right? Remember the Akedah, we read about it every Rosh Hashanah, as well as in the normal cycle of the Torah, the near sacrifice of Isaac. When he decides not to sacrifice Isaac, what does he find ready and waiting for him? a sheep, a male sheep, a ram, right? But it's a sheep. And so Isaac and the ram become synonymous. And
The goat alludes to Yaakov, for it is a step down from the sheep, and we find that it was said by Rivka to Yaakov, "Go now to the flock and take for me 2 young goats," and because of the skins which he wore upon his hands and his neck at the time of his father's blessing.
all right, so Jacob, what does he get associated with? He gets associated with the cows, because that's what he used to
The goat,
prepare.
the goat.
Sorry, the goats, in order to prepare, in order to
Get the skin.
get the blessing from his father under those interesting circumstances, and it was the skins that he wore in order to pretend to be his brother. And by the way, if you've ever wondered how did goat skins make him seem more like his brother, how hairy was his brother, goat skins are different than sheep skins. Right? It's not the giant woolly thing. It's a very smooth hair. And indeed, if you were rubbing it like this, you would feel hair strands, but you wouldn't necessarily feel that the whole thing is covered in fur. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to stroke a goat, but it's not the same as stroking a sheep. It's much closer to a horse, if you've ever had a chance to pet a horse, which unless you run the hand deliberately across the hair, you're not going to feel that it's covered in hair. It feels mostly smooth with a few strands. Okay.
Since these 3 species allude to the 3 patriarchs, God commanded in Genesis, and God said to him.
Okay, so pause real quick. So this section in Genesis, the Brit Bein HaBetarim, is the section when God is making a covenant to Abraham. Abraham takes the animals, he cuts them in half and walks between the path, between the parts. And this is where he has the vision of his descendants going down into a land not of their own, becoming oppressed, and then being returned. So in this vision is where he has this, this sacrifice is where he has this major vision. And lo and behold, what shows up at the sacrifice?
Take me a heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon, to hint to them as I explained above.
Right, so we get a cow, we get a sheep, a goat, and we get a sheep. All 3 of the main species show up in this idea, which is entirely about the future of what's coming. Him, his son, his grandson, and the 2 birds are...
Those 3 refer to the 3 ancestors, do they not? They refer to Abraham.
Right, but Abraham is the one doing this sacrifice.
He's doing it, that's
right.
Him, and from him is going to come the turtle dove and the young pigeon,
eventually,
which allude to Moshe and Aaron.
Right. So, bada bing, bada boom. Wow. By the 5 animals that he sacrifices, he is making reference to all of them. Now, if you're interested in how we get the turtle dove and Moses and Aaron, there's more commentary on the connection there. It just didn't fit on the page. So he does justify that connection through the symbolism in other parts of Tanakh, but unfortunately it doesn't fit, so we'll be moving on. So think of what he is now transferred. When we think about sacrificing a cow or a sheep or a goat, we are thinking now not just about a cow, a sheep, and a goat. We are thinking about our ancestors. We are thinking about the patriarchs, the founders of the chain that became our people, that became our connection to God. And as we offer them up, we now have a different level of symbolism and of mindfulness in this act. That it's not just me and an animal and a priest, but it's me, an animal, a priest, and the entirety of my family tree, and the entirety of my family's history, and the entirety of our people's covenant with God. Not bad from a couple of cows.
Yeah.
And it's very neat and tidy. Now, there's one other connection, of course, which he doesn't spell out, which becomes very important for us in the modern world, which is what happens to the sacrifices that's connected to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We can't do the sacrifices anymore. Right? But what do we do in their place?
Say prayers.
Prayer, right? Prayer, tefillah, has become our sacrifice. And there's 3 main forms of prayer. There is shacharit, which is the morning prayer. And there is mincha, which don't be confused by the mincha over here, which is the afternoon prayer. And then there is mariv, which is the evening prayer. And guess what our sages have taught in other locations? Shacharit was established by Abraham, Mincha was established by Isaac, and Jacob established Mariv. So when you are doing the mincha or mariv or shachari prayers, you should be also thinking about the chain of our ancestors as they each contributed their own connection to God that we could then follow in their footsteps and grow in our own connection to God personally. And that the system of sacrifices did that, and our system of prayer duplicates that in its own way. We may not have a cow, a sheep, and a goat that we can use, but we can still use the same metaphor for our own system of prayer.
And there were 3 sacrifices during the day.
Exactly, yes. And these 3 services were instituted precisely to parallel the sacrificial cycle in an average day of the temple. So they were parallel to the sacrifices and also considered to have been established by the avot, by our ancestors. The prayer services by the ancestors. Okay, that's just one reason.
That's just one.
Let's try reason number 2.
The second reason that these species were chosen from the category of those which travel on 4 legs and those which fly for korbanot is to allude to the Israelite nation. For behold, the prophets often called them by the name cattle in Hosea, sheep and flock in Jeremiah and Ezra.
Ezekiel, actually.
Oh, Ezekiel, right. And goats, Isaiah.
And there are other citations as well. Again, in the interest of space, I didn't put all of the quotes that Abarbanel brings.
Therefore, God commanded that they sacrifice their korbanot from these species, which are similar to them, such that it is like they offered their own blood and their flesh.
What do we think? Right? And when we look through the biblical poetry, the prophets often refer to Israel by, guess what? Cows, sheep, and goats. As far as the animal motifs go, those are the 3 biggies that we get constantly referred to by the prophets. And he's saying, so therefore, is it any surprise that when God tells us to offer up an animal, that the same animals that are part of our poetry would be the animals that are going to be on our altar? So that as the cow, the sheep, or the goat is being sacrificed, we feel us going through this process. This is me that is being sacrificed, not literally, of course, but me spiritually, that I am growing through this process. It's not just happening to the animal, it is happening to me. And just as it is being translated into something that is pure and holy, so too I am being translated in this service into something that is greater than I was before. And that wouldn't have worked if it had been an animal that was not also an animal that was commonly used for the poetry to refer to the nations of Israel, or the nation of Israel. What a coinkydink. Who would have thought that the poetry would match up with exactly the animals that are used? Well, if you got one author for the whole thing, it kind of works out more easily. All right.
It does all tie back to the covenant between the parts.
And it all goes back to that first covenant between the parts with Abraham.
That was the first time. Well,
it wasn't the first time, but it's the most explicit statement where God tells him to bring these things. In most of the other sacrifices that Abraham does, he spontaneously offers whatever he seems to feel like. But in the covenant between the parts, all of a sudden God is saying, I want this and this and this, and then a couple of those. And those couple of those is what's going to lead us into our next paragraph. The however.
However, if he is poor and he is not able to afford this, the Lord commanded that he offer from the turtle doves and from the pigeons, since the nation is compared to them as well, as is stated in what, Song of Songs?
Song of Songs.
And the Rambam wrote that these 2 species were chosen because they are faithful to their mate, and so too is Israel with God.
All right, so remember I said a long time ago, at least it feels that way, that we would talk about what happens if you can't afford. And I said that yes, if for the voluntary offering, if you can't afford, you can't afford, because God is allowed to set a bar in order to reach a certain goal by having it be the minimum. But when it comes to the sacrifices that are required, the sacrifices that a person has to do on certain occasions, God very deliberately, very explicitly pushes the bar down as low as absolutely possible, to the point where the guy over there is bringing a cow because he can afford it, and you're able to bring a pigeon because that's what you can afford, which are the most commonly available and easily caught, even if you don't own one, animal to bring to the altar. And why pigeons and turtle doves? Why are they allowed? Why not a squirrel or something? Because pigeons and turtle doves are also used as a reference to the nation of Israel in Song of Songs, which is a love song between us and God in the metaphorical reading of our tradition. And therefore, it is only fitting, Rambam points out, that these two species of bird happen to be species that mate for life, that are faithful to their spouse. They don't just run around hopping from nest to nest. And by the way, that's why pigeons and doves have always been considered a romantic symbol, and you'll see them even in non-Jewish sources as being a romantic pair. Remember, doves are white pigeons. It's got better reputations than being a pigeon. They, I don't know if you've ever seen, but pigeons and doves, when they are a mating pair, do look very affectionate to one another. My grandmother, may she rest in peace, used to keep doves in an aviary in her house, and you could sit there, and the two of them would just curl up next to each other, heads sort of intertwined, and it is a very, very pretty, very romantic, very faithful image. And Abarbanel goes on to quote from even books of philosophy and natural philosophy that talk about this and say, yeah, even people that aren't Jewish recognize this. And that should be the metaphor of our relationship to God, which, if you remember well at the beginning, what does the word korban come from? Closeness, right? Bringing us close to God. Exactly. So it all fits together. It all fits together if you look at more than just the technical details of where to stick the knife. Okay. One last thing we got to take care of, which is this stuff down here in the bottom corner. Right, our mincha sacrifices, because these are the only things that don't have a pulse.
The substance of the mincha offering is flour, oil, wine, and frankincense. Since the manner of a mincha present,
Right, mincha can also mean a present or a gift,
is that which a person sends to his master to ascend upon the table of the king, the Lord commanded that its substance be of those more necessary and choice items in the table food, which are bread, oil, and wine.
All right, so let's make sure we got his line of argument. Right, he's saying, okay, so the mincha offering, this is not meat, and this is of any variety. But that doesn't mean it can just be anything you feel like. It should be something that we learn from, or we understand better, that have a certain standing within our own eyes or within the eyes of the community, both as being the most fundamental of our life and the most necessary for our life, as well as the most choice, the most important things and the most favored things that would reach the king's table. And these happen to be bread, oil, and wine. And how do we know that these three happen to be, just again, coincidentally spelled out in another part of the Bible as being important? From the Psalm for Rosh Chodesh.
And wine that makes glad the heart of man, making face brighter than oil, and bread that sustains man's heart.
Bada bing, bada boom. The three things that happen to go into a mincha offering: the flour, which is the bread, the wine, and the oil. We have the three things that happen to make up the mincha offering. And
to improve its smell, they added frankincense.
Which, again, I love the fact that he finishes on the very practical note, which is, and when you put some frankincense in, it smells a whole lot better.
Now, it's not just one person coming with one sacrifice. They have this thing going on all day.
Correct.
Day.
And there are
That's
communal sacrifices and there are individual sacrifices, yes.
Right, they're coming to the temple over there, everybody there. Ultimately, does this become food for the Levites?
For the Kohanim, yes, absolutely.
So they eat these
Right.
foods afterwards. I mean, I'm assuming that the birds are sacrificed with their feathers on and so forth.
Well, again, it's more, the blood is what usually goes on to the and the fat of certain parts of the body is what usually goes on the altar and is consumed on the fire. It's the meat that is usually left over, and so yes, the vast majority of the meat of the vast majority of the sacrifices and the grain sacrifices as well is not burnt up. In fact, there's only like one sacrifice that the entire thing is incinerated, or one category of sacrifice. The rest is eaten by the priests. And specifically, as we're going to find out later on, since the priests do not receive an inheritance of the land of Israel, but instead receive the inheritance of doing this job, they need something to eat, or else they're going to starve to death.
Right.
Now, the amount of sacrifices that were happening at any one time is kind of a rough thing to estimate. Bless you. there was a definite daily sacrifice, which was minimal in terms of how many animals were being offered each day by the community. And an individual, apart from the three pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, wouldn't necessarily have to come unless they had a special event in their life or a special transgression that they were having to bring a sacrifice because of. So it wasn't as though everybody would be going to the altar every single day. In fact, most people would not be going to the altar most days. It would be a rare occurrence during the year. 3 times obligatory, and then the rest, you know, here and there. And so it's hard to estimate.
But it seems to me at some point there would be a superfluity of meat and no freezers and no refrigeration, whatever.
Not just that, but also...
do they ever offer these to those who you say are poor?
Absolutely. Right. So when you have things, for example, the festival offerings for Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot, we are expressly commanded to offer the extra to the poor and the Levite and others who don't have anything of their own. From whatever God has blessed us, we must share with them. And it's not just that we don't have refrigeration or such. We are told not to keep it past 3 days. So even if we'd had Tupperware, we still wouldn't be able to keep it for that long. So yes, there are built-in sharing requirements or incentives in some cases to make sure that the meat is not just left to rot. It is supposed to be eaten by the Kohanim or by the extended family of the person offering it, and by the extended community, including the poor.
Seems sort of, you know, in a way, cynical maybe, I don't know, that what we're sacrificing on the altar to God is the head and the entrails and blood, whatever, but that the good cuts...
And that's not cynical. It is inspired, because the whole purpose, not the whole purpose, one of the main purposes of the book of Leviticus is to shift our mind from the pagan notion that we were feeding God, right? That we were feeding, that God needed our sacrifices to live or to grow powerful or to be able to do what we wanted him to do to defend us and prosper us and all of that. And so very, very deliberately, we don't burn the stuff we eat. We don't make that the main parts of the sacrifices. Because God doesn't need that. The sacrifice is for us, not to sustain God. So specifically, what you call cynicism is meant to be inspired. We're not going to do anything that might make someone think that I'm putting this slab of meat out for God, the same way someone might leave cookies for Santa Claus.
So people who now are working towards rebuilding
Yes.
the temple,
Mm-hmm.
is their plan that we would go back to the sacrificing of cows, goats, cows, sheep, and goats?
The people who are working to, there's 2 main categories. There are some people who are working to rebuild the temple, and they are extremely politically dangerous at the moment. And then there are people who are working to be prepared for the rebuilding of the temple, and they are slightly less politically charged, but they're working on making sure we've got all the tools should the temple be rebuilt tomorrow. Both groups envision absolutely that the full sacrificial system will be reinstated. However, throughout Jewish history, there have been many different sages that have argued that all or almost none of the sacrifices may actually be reinstituted in the days of Mashiach, of the Messiah. And it is I can't exactly say it's hotly debated because people don't stay up at night worrying about this too often. There are more pressing concerns. But it is widely debated exactly what will or won't happen come the restoration in the days of Mashiach. So it's not something to lose sleep over for the most of us. You never know.
No.
You never know. It could be tomorrow. It could be 1,000 years from now. All right. Great. Thank you very much. And remember that even when we're doing our other mitzvot, look at the details of what's being done, of why it's being done, of what connections it has to other parts of Judaism. Because it is never just an isolated little act, an isolated little set of instructions. There is always meant to be a network of meaning that stretches wider than just whatever specific action is that you are undertaking. And we'll continue to explore that as we continue our way through the book of Leviticus. Come on, wakey, wakey.